The Galactic Academy's Xenohistorical Simulation Chamber was a marvel of technological precision. Constructed from meta-alloys that could reconstruct molecular memories of entire civilizations, it towered like a cathedral of knowledge. Today, it would become something far more, a crucible of understanding. 30 alien cadets filed into the chamber, each representing a different stellar civilization. Their bodies were as diverse as the galaxies they called home. Morrican of the Krullovax, a crystalline being whose body refracted light like a living prism, sat rigid in the third row. Beside him, the Psi-Lune twins, Aria and Zora, their tentacular forms carefully coiled to minimize physical contact with neighboring seats. The Zorn-Tak cadet, Catul, wore an exoskeleton that hummed with electromagnetic sensitivity, capable of detecting the slightest emotional fluctuation. Professor Xyltak moved with deliberate slowness, an Arconian researcher with centuries of interspecies studies behind him. He understood the delicate nature of what was about to unfold. His multiple eyes, each a different color and capable of perceiving spectrums beyond traditional light, scanned the room. This was more than a historical simulation. This was a cultural dissection. Cadets, his voice resonated through translation matrices that captured not just words, but emotional nuance. Today we will examine a species that has confused, terrified, and fascinated galactic researchers for generations. Humans. The chamber's atmospheric processors adjusted, creating a psychoadaptive environment that would help the cadets process potentially traumatic historical data. Standard procedure for species with fundamentally different cognitive structures. The first holographic image materialized, a prehistoric landscape, rocks, primitive vegetation, and there, a human, alone, facing a dire wolf. Morrican's crystalline structure began to vibrate. The creature before them was nothing like the sanitized historical record suggested. This was no advanced technological being. This was raw, unfiltered survival. The human held a sharpened stone. No armor, no advanced weaponry. Just a crude implement and an expression that defied every known survival algorithm. Determination mixed with a primal calculation that seemed to laugh in the face of biological limitations. The dire wolf attacked. Most species would retreat, calculate, analyze potential survival strategies. This human did something entirely unexpected. He stepped forward. The holographic simulation captured every microscopic detail. The wolf's muscle tension, the human's weight distribution, the calculated risk that should have resulted in certain death. Instead, what followed was a dance of survival that made several cadets' biological monitoring systems spike with incomprehension. Stone met muscle. Strategy met instinct. The human didn't just survive. He transformed the very concept of survival into an art form. Catul's exoskeleton began to emit a low-frequency hum, the Zorn-Tak equivalent of a gasp. This defies every known biomechanical probability, he whispered, his communication tendrils writhing with a mixture of horror and fascination. Professor Xyltak allowed a rare smile. The cadets had no idea what was coming. This was merely the first layer of a complex narrative that would challenge everything they understood about conflict, adaptation, and the fundamental nature of intelligent life. The simulation was just beginning, and humanity was about to rewrite every rule they thought they knew. The holographic landscape exploded with chaos. World War I materialized around the stunned alien cadets like a fever dream of technological madness. The Psi-Lune twins, Aria and Zora, pressed their neural-linked tentacles against their sensory dampeners, struggling to process the inconceivable scene before them. Mud, blood, trenches carved into the earth like open wounds. And humans, everywhere, humans. Professor Xyltak's commentary ran underneath the visual assault. Observe their technological progression. In mere decades, they transformed from horse-mounted cavalry to mechanized warfare. His multispectral eyes tracked each movement, each impossible adaptation. The first tanks rumbled across the battlefield, crude metal monsters birthed from industrial desperation. Morrigan's crystalline body fractured slightly, the Krellvax equivalent of a gasp. These were not just machines. They were living extensions of human determination. Kull, the Zorntak Cadet, ran complex probability matrices through his exoskeleton's computational systems. The numbers made no sense. A species with minimal technological foundation suddenly developing mechanized warfare, aerial combat, and communication technologies that should have taken centuries, not years, to evolve. "This is impossible," Kull muttered, his communication tendrils writhing with mathematical distress. Their rate of technological adaptation defies every known evolutionary trajectory. The simulation zoomed, a pilot in a wooden biplane. Fabric and wire. No advanced shielding. No quantum stabilization. Just raw human audacity lifting him thousands of feet into the air. The pilot's face, visible through the primitive goggles, showed something more terrifying than any technological marvel. Absolute fearlessness. Area, one of the Psi-Lune twins, began a rapid neurological download of the data. Her tentacles moved in complex patterns, trying to make sense of what she was witnessing. Humans didn't just create technology. They weaponized innovation itself. World War II erupted across the holographic landscape. Radar, jet engines, atomic research. Each technological leap was accompanied by an almost impossible human characteristic: the ability to transform limitation into opportunity. The nuclear bomb materialized, a weapon of such devastating potential that most species would have immediately restricted its development. Humans did something else entirely. They created the weapon, then immediately developed protocols to prevent its use. "Look," Professor Zyltak's voice cut through the cadets' collective shock. "They create the most destructive technology in their history, and simultaneously establish international agreements to prevent its deployment." Kull's computational systems were overloading. The Zorntak Cadet's exoskeleton began to emit a high-pitched resonance, a sound that translated roughly to existential confusion. The technological progression was not linear. It was viral, explosive. Each conflict became a crucible of innovation. Communication technologies, medical advancements, materials science, computational theory. Everything accelerated through conflict. Microwave ovens, developed from radar research. GPS, a military navigation system. Jet engines, birthed from war's desperate need for speed. Computers, created to break military encryption. Humans turned destruction into creation with a efficiency that bordered on the mystical. Morrigan's crystalline structure began to pulse with a strange luminescence. He was no longer just observing. He was beginning to understand something profound about this species. Humans were not just a civilization. They were a force of nature. The simulation continued, and the alien cadets watched, transfixed, terrified, and increasingly in awe. The holographic simulation transformed. Gone were the mechanical landscapes of technological warfare. Now, the chamber filled with something far more complex, the internal battleground of human psychological resilience. Professor Zyltak's multiple eyes narrowed, each focusing on a different cadet. This was the segment of the simulation that separated the academically curious from those truly capable of understanding the human phenomenon. The first scene materialized. A soldier, wounded, isolated, communication systems destroyed, surrounded, outnumbered. Every logical survival protocol screamed for retreat, for capitulation. The human did not retreat. Kull's exoskeleton began to emit a complex harmonic resonance, the Zorntak equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. His computational systems struggled to process the image before him. This wasn't just survival. This was something else entirely. Morrigan's crystalline body shifted colors rapidly, a kaleidoscopic display of emotional processing that would take synapsologists decades to fully decode. The Krellvax were a species of pure strategic calculation. Survival was a mathematical equation. This human represented something beyond mathematics. The simulation zoomed into multiple scenarios. A resistance fighter maintaining hope in a concentration camp, a pilot continuing a mission with multiple system failures, a medic treating wounded enemies. Each moment was a direct challenge to every known understanding of conflict, survival, and psychological endurance. Observe. Professor Xyltak's voice cut through the holographic landscape, the human capacity to transform suffering into resistance. The Sideloom twins, Aria and Zura, intertwined their neural-linked tentacles. Their species understood collective consciousness. But this was something different. Individual resilience that defied collective survival protocols. A World War I resistance fighter materialized. Captured. Tortured. Every conventional understanding suggested complete psychological breakdown. Instead, the human maintained a network of communication, provided critical intelligence, maintained hope. Hope, Cattell whispered, his computational systems struggling to quantify the concept, is not a measurable resource. But for humans, it was a weapon more powerful than any technological marvel. The simulation shifted, a modern scenario. A humanitarian mission in a conflict zone. Civilians rescued. Medical aid provided. No strategic gain. No territorial advantage. Pure, unquantifiable compassion. Morrican's crystalline structure began to fracture. The Krelvak's equivalent of uncontrollable weeping. "They're not just surviving," he whispered. "They're transforming the very concept of survival." Professor Xyltak allowed himself a rare moment of emotional display, a slight shimmer in his multiple eyes that suggested something close to pride, close to wonder. Each scenario challenged fundamental understandings of conflict, resilience, and interspecies psychology. Humans did not just endure. They transformed endurance into an art form. A quote burned itself into the holographic display. Words from a human resistance fighter. "They can take everything from me except my ability to choose how I respond." The alien cadets sat in stunned silence. This was no longer a historical simulation. This was a revelation. The simulation chamber pulsed with a strange electricity. Holographic data streams cascaded around the alien cadets like rivers of liquid information, each droplet telling a story more complex than entire galactic archives. Professor Xyltak's voice resonated with a subtle undertone of academic excitement. Humans transform conflict into creation with the efficiency that defies every known evolutionary model. The first visualization materialized. A timeline of human innovations born directly from warfare and conflict. Each breakthrough was a punch to the collective alien understanding of technological progression. The microwave oven. Developed from radar research during World War II. GPS navigation. Originally a military satellite tracking system. Jet engines. Birthed from the desperate need for aerial superiority. Computers. Created to break military encryption and calculate ballistic trajectories. Cattell's exoskeleton began running rapid computational matrices. His Zorntak neural networks were literally vibrating with mathematical confusion. These weren't just technological advancements. They were quantum leaps that violated every known innovation trajectory. Morrican's crystalline body shifted through a spectrum of colors, a language of emotional processing unique to the Krelvaks. Each color represented a different level of comprehension. And right now, he was experiencing something close to existential revelation. The Sideloom twins, Aria and Zura, intertwined their neural-linked tentacles, processing the data in perfect synchronization. Their collective consciousness was struggling to comprehend a species that could transform the most devastating human impulses into revolutionary technologies. "Look," Professor Xyltak commanded, "at how they weaponize curiosity." A new holographic stream erupted. The Manhattan Project, a terrifying collaboration of the most brilliant human minds, united to create the most destructive weapon in human history. But what followed was even more shocking. Immediately after developing atomic technology, humans established international protocols to prevent its widespread use. They created diplomatic frameworks, established research committees, developed fail-safe mechanisms. The same minds that created unprecedented destruction immediately pivoted to prevent that destruction. Kittel's computational systems were overloading. "This is not rational," he muttered, his communication tendrils writhing with mathematical distress. No species develops a weapon of total annihilation and then immediately works to prevent its use. But humans did exactly that. Medical innovations flowered from military research. Communication technologies exploded from battlefield necessities. Material science advanced through the crucible of conflict. The space race, perhaps the most profound example of human innovation, emerged directly from military rocket technology. Missiles became space shuttles. Weapons research became planetary exploration. Area, one of the Psi-Lun twins, initiated a comprehensive data download. Her tentacles moved in complex fractal patterns, trying to process the unprecedented nature of human innovation. They do not see destruction and creation as opposing forces, Professor Gvideltak explained. For humans, they are part of the same continuous process of understanding. Morrigan's crystalline structure began to pulse with a strange luminescence. He was no longer just observing. He was beginning to understand something profound about this species. Humans were not just innovators. They were transformation incarnate. The simulation continued, and the alien cadets watched, transfixed, terrified, and increasingly in awe of a species that could turn the very concept of limitation into an opportunity for unprecedented growth. The simulation chamber transformed. Gone were the mechanical landscapes of technological warfare. Now the holographic environment became a living, breathing tapestry of human emotional complexity, a terrain more intricate and treacherous than any physical battlefield. Professor Gvideltak's multiple eyes narrowed, each focusing on a different emotional frequency. "Prepare yourselves," he warned, "for the most challenging segment of human understanding." The first image materialized, a concentration camp liberation. Soldiers who had been fighting each other moments before now worked together to save survivors. Enemies becoming rescuers, hatred transforming into compassion in the span of a single breath. Kittel's exoskeleton began to emit a low, complex harmonic resonance, a sound that translated to profound cognitive dissonance. His computational systems were trying and failing to categorize the emotional spectrum before him. The Psi-Lun twins, Area and Zara, intertwined their neural-linked tentacles, their collective consciousness struggling to process the impossible scene. These humans defied every known psychological model of in-group and out-group dynamics. A sequence of contradictions unfolded. The same species that developed atomic weapons created global humanitarian aid programs. Soldiers who committed acts of violence and war became advocates for peace. Cultures that practiced systematic oppression simultaneously developed universal human rights declarations. Morrigan's crystalline body shifted through a kaleidoscope of colors, a language of emotional processing that would take synapsologists generations to fully decode. The Krelvax understood strategy as a mathematical equation. These humans turned emotion into a multidimensional battlefield. Observe their capacity for simultaneous destruction and creation. Professor Gvideltak's voice cut through the holographic landscape. A war photographer materialized, documenting human suffering, not as a passive observer, but as an active witness, capturing moments of horror to prevent future horrors. The camera became a weapon more powerful than any physical instrument of war. "This is not documentation," Kittel whispered, his communication tendrils writhing with confusion. "This is transformation." The simulation zoomed through historical moments of reconciliation, former enemies building schools together, communities destroyed by conflict coming together to rebuild, survivors of genocide working to prevent future atrocities. Area, one of the Psi-Lun twins, initiated a comprehensive emotional data download. Her tentacles moved in complex fractal patterns, trying to map the unmappable human emotional landscape. A United Nations peacekeeping mission materialized. Soldiers from different nations, with different cultural backgrounds, working together to protect civilians. not for territorial gain, not for strategic advantage, simply because it was the right thing to do. Compassion, Professor Galactic explained, is not a weakness for humans. It is a strategic imperative. A holographic display burned with a quote from a human rights activist. To recognize the humanity in those who have been taught to hate is the most revolutionary act of all. Morrigan's crystalline structure began to fracture, the Krelvax equivalent of uncontrollable emotional revelation. "They're not just surviving," he whispered. "They're redefining the very concept of survival." The alien cadets sat in stunned silence. This was no longer a historical simulation. This was a profound exploration of what it means to be sentient. Tension crackled through the simulation chamber like electromagnetic static. 15 cadets rose simultaneously, their bodies a collective expression of existential rejection. "This is madness," shouted Vexnar, a Quilarian cadet with prismatic skin that now swirled in patterns of pure agitation. "Humans are not a species. They are a force of uncontrolled chaos." The remaining 15 leaned forward, their postures transforming from academic observers to something closer to reverence. Professor Galactic stood motionless, allowing the conflict to unfold. This moment was more than a classroom debate. This was a crucible of interspecies understanding. Hill's exoskeleton hummed with computational intensity. His neural networks were processing multiple scenarios, each more impossible than the last. The walking cadets represented fear. The seated cadets represented something closer to awe. "They are unpredictable," argued Zelma, one of the departing Cylon researchers. Her tentacles writhed with mathematical panic. "A species that can create and destroy with equal passion is fundamentally dangerous." Morrigan, still seated, responded with a crystalline resonance that cut through the chamber's charged atmosphere. "Unpredictability is not weakness," he said. "It is the most advanced form of adaptive intelligence." The holographic displays continued to pulse around them, showing human moments of both incredible destruction and unprecedented compassion. Wars, reconciliations, technological leaps, humanitarian efforts. Each image was a challenge to conventional understanding. Professor Galactic's multiple eyes tracked every reaction. This was the moment of true learning, when confrontation revealed the depth of understanding. "Humans are not a linear species," he interjected, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of research. "They are a continuous state of becoming. Dangerous, potentially, extraordinary, undeniably." The departing cadets paused. Their body languages spoke volumes, fear mixed with a reluctant respect. Vexnar turned, prismatic skin now displaying complex geometric patterns of emotional turbulence. "A species that can create weapons of total annihilation and then immediately work to prevent their use. That is not rational." "Precisely," murmured Aria, one of the Cylon twins who remained seated, "and that is what makes them remarkable." The chamber's holographic systems continued to display a montage of human complexity. A soldier saving an enemy's life. A scientist developing a cure after studying a weapon's biological impact. Communities rebuilding after devastating conflicts. 15 saw terror. 15 saw potential. Cadets' computational systems reached a breakthrough. Humans were not a problem to be solved. They were a phenomenon to be understood. "We are witnessing," Professor Galactic announced, "the most complex species in known galactic history." The walking cadets hesitated at the chamber's exit, not with certainty, but with a growing realization that certainty itself was a limitation. Morrigan's crystalline structure pulsed with a luminescence that suggested something beyond mere observation. He was no longer just analyzing. He was understanding. Humans were not just a species. They were a continuous revolution. The simulation continued, and the fracture in the cadets' collective understanding became a gateway to something far more profound than simple academic learning. The simulation chamber transformed. No longer a clinical historical review, it became a living, breathing exploration of human complexity. The remaining 15 cadets leaned forward, their body languages a symphony of intellectual tension. Morrican's crystalline structure pulsed with an inner luminescence that defied his species' typically analytical nature. His multiple fractal surfaces caught and refracted the holographic light, creating a kaleidoscope of emotional processing. "Watch," Professor Galactic commanded, "and truly see." The first image materialized. A humanitarian mission in a war-torn region. Soldiers who had been fighting became rescuers. Medical personnel treating enemies with the same care as allies. Technology of destruction transformed into instruments of healing. Kittle's exoskeleton began to emit a complex harmonic resonance, a sound that translated to profound cognitive recalibration. His computational systems were rewriting fundamental understanding with each passing moment. The Siloam twins, Arya and Zara, intertwined their neural-linked tentacles, their collective consciousness creating intricate mapping patterns. Humans didn't just exist in binary states of conflict and peace. They operated in a multidimensional spectrum of existence that defied traditional categorization. A sequence of impossible moments unfolded. Scientists who developed weapons of mass destruction becoming advocates for global disarmament. Military engineers creating technologies that transformed medical research. Soldiers becoming diplomats, warriors becoming peacemakers. Observe their capacity for metamorphosis. Professor Galactic explained, "Humans do not simply change. They transform." The holographic display burned with a quote from a human philosopher. "In the depth of winter, I finally learned that within me there lay an invincible summer." Arya initiated a comprehensive data download. Her tentacles moved in complex fractal patterns, attempting to map the unmappable human emotional landscape. These were not just individual stories. These were collective revelations about the nature of sentience itself. A space exploration sequence materialized. Humans sending probes into the vast unknown. Not for conquest, not for resource extraction, but from a pure, almost childlike sense of curiosity. Each mission a love letter to the unknown. Kittle's computational systems reached a breakthrough. "They are not exploring space," he whispered. "They are expanding the very concept of exploration." The simulation zoomed through moments of unexpected connection. A veteran creating a peace foundation. A scientist developing clean energy technologies. Communities rebuilding after devastating conflicts. Morrican's crystalline body began to fracture. The Krellvax equivalent of an emotional breakthrough. "They're rewriting the fundamental rules of existence," he murmured. Professor Galactic allowed himself a rare moment of emotional display. A subtle shimmer in his multiple eyes suggested something close to pride, close to wonder. The remaining cadets were no longer just observers. They had become witnesses to a profound transformation of understanding. A final holographic image burned itself into the chamber's atmosphere. A human child's drawing of peace. Simple, profound, impossible to quantify through any known scientific measurement. Compassion, Professor Galactic concluded, is not a weakness. It is the most advanced form of strategic intelligence. The alien cadets sat in stunned silence. This was no longer a historical simulation. This was a revelation about the very nature of sentient existence. Silence. Not the quiet of emptiness, but the profound stillness that follows a fundamental understanding of the universe. The simulation chamber hung suspended in a moment of collective revelation. 30 alien cadets, 15 who had fled in terror, 15 who remained, were forever changed. Professor Galactic moved with a deliberation that belied the magnitude of what had just occurred. His multiple eyes scanned the room, each capturing a different nuance of the emotional landscape. "Cadet reports," he commanded. Call was the first to speak. His exoskeleton, previously a rigid computational matrix, now seemed to pulse with something closer to organic life. "Humans are not a species," he said, his voice resonating with a complexity that would have been impossible hours earlier. "They are a continuous state of becoming." Morrican's crystalline structure, once a perfect geometric form, now existed in a state of beautiful fragmentation. "We have been asking the wrong questions," the Krellvax cadet murmured. Humans are not defined by what they are. They are defined by what they choose to become. The Psi-Lun twins, Arya and Zara, completed each other's thoughts in a neural-linked cascade of understanding. They transform limitation into opportunity, conflict into creation, destruction into possibility. Professor Galactic allowed himself a rare moment of pride. This was more than an academic exercise. This was a fundamental reimagining of interspecies understanding. The first official report would be revolutionary. Not a clinical dissection of human history, but a profound exploration of sentient potential. Vexinar, one of the cadets who had initially fled, returned. The prismatic Quilarian skin now displayed a complex tapestry of emotions. Fear transformed into a tentative respect. "We were wrong," the cadet admitted. Completely and utterly wrong. The holographic systems continued to pulse with human moments, not just of war, but of unexpected connection, of transformation, of hope. A quote from a human resistance fighter burned itself into the chamber's atmospheric processors. "In the face of impossible odds, we do not break. We bend. We transform." Kittle's computational systems reached a final profound conclusion. "Humans are not measuring their existence by survival," he said. "They are measuring it by potential." Professor Galactic stepped forward, his final lecture of the day etched into the very fabric of the simulation chamber. "We came seeking to understand human warfare. We discovered something far more profound, the nature of resilience itself." The 15 who remained were no longer just cadets. They were witnesses to a fundamental galactic revelation. Half had walked out in fear. Half remained in awe. But all were changed. Humanity had entered the galactic stage, not as a species to be categorized, but as a force to be understood. The simulation ended, but the true exploration was just beginning.